Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Anamnesis Anyder. This is the brand new dungeon made available through the main scenario questline in patch 5.2 in Final Fantasy XIV, Echoes of a Fallen Star. The bosses in this dungeon can sure shell out some damage, and you may find yourself drowning in mechanics, depth gripping that controller, and wailing for help into the unknown. Don't worry though, I'm here to throw you a lifesaver. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your dungeon guide. In this first section, we ride on the back of Bismarck battling an assortment of sea creatures as they come in. Watch out for the usual AoE attacks and keep that tank alive. Eventually, you'll arrive at the Garden of Recollection, where you'll face off against the first boss, the Unknown. Fetid Fang will deal high damage to the primary target. Healers keep an eye out and tanks pop those coolies. Throughout the encounter, the boss will move into the center of the room, spawn a massive number of exploding orbs, and begin scrutinizing the platform. Players will first need to find a safe spot in between the exploding orbs, but also be aware of the arrow rotating around the boss clockwise. This arrow begins spinning quickly and then eventually slows down. Once it slows, it'll tick another 4 times before settling and throwing out a large conal AoE in that direction. This coincides with the explosion of the orbs. To handle this, players will need to make sure they're in a safe spot between the orbs that's not in the incoming path of the rotating arrow. If you find yourself in the wrong spot, try to avoid panicking and running through multiple attacks. If you stay in that safe spot, you'll only get hit by the one arrow attack, which is survivable. These attacks do place a stacking vulnerability debuff on you, so make sure you minimize getting hit. Luminous Ray will blast the platform directly in front of the boss in a long column. Move out from in front of him. Inscrutability will deal high group-wide damage and place a bleed debuff on all players. Healers will need to stay on top of this healing as the bleed cannot be dispelled. During the next scrutiny segment, a clone of the boss will appear and target a player with this lineup marker. Players will need to handle the orbs and the arrow in the same manner while stacking together to share the damage from that clone attack. From this point on, there will be 2 bosses on the platform and the tank will need to ensure they have enmity on both. Players will need to watch out for Clear Out, a frontal cone attack. You can destroy the original boss first before refocusing on the clone. Once the first boss is destroyed, the clone will cast Plain Weirdness, giving itself a damage up buff. Mechanics will repeat with increased damage until the boss is down. The next segment of trash mobs has the potential for big pulls, so be ready with those shields, heals, coolies, and deeps. The second boss is Kyklops. The final verse will deal high group-wide damage. Healers beware. 2000 Mina's Swing will knock back and deal high damage to anything in melee range. The telegraph for this attack is quite short, and players will need to use the cast bar to pre-position safely out of range. 2000 Mina's Swipe is a large frontal cone. Players will again use the cast bar to identify the type of attack and then move out from in front of the boss to avoid it. Throughout the encounter, the boss will move to the center and cast either Terrible Hammer or Terrible Blade. This will mark the individual squares of the platform with red hammers or blue blades. The order that the boss marks up these squares with these 2 indicators will be the order that they will eventually explode in. Players will need to pre-position on the second weapon squares while dodging boss mechanics and waiting for the first weapon squares to explode. Once they do, they'll need to quickly move into those safe zones to avoid the second weapon explosions. Raging Glower will have the boss turning to a random player and casting a long frontal column attack. Move out from in front of him as necessary. Open Hearth will mark up a player for stack up damage. Move together to share that incoming damage. Wanderer's Pyre will target players for circle AoE attacks. Spread these apart to avoid overlapping damage. Eye of the Cyclone is a room-wide donut attack. All players will need to move into melee range once the cast bar begins to avoid excess damage. These mechanics will repeat until the boss is down. In the next segment of Trash, these mobs will attempt to recharge these crystals. If you kill them before the cast goes off, great. If not, you'll have to deal with a few extra mobs that will spawn from each crystal. Tanks be ready to pick up everything, go nuts with that AoE damage, and hope that your healer didn't forget to repair her gear before the run. Finally, we reach the final boss, Rullus Dean. The aptly named Bonebreaker will target the primary target with a heavy-hitting tank buster. Cooldown and heal as necessary. Periodically, the boss will jump somewhere on the platform and cast Seabed Ceremony, which will deal high group-wide damage and spawn columns of water around the platform. This first variation has the middle of the platform covered by water. The boss will then cast Depth Grip, which will spawn a number of watery hands in sequence. 2 players will also be targeted with large circle falling water AoEs that they'll need to move away from others. Eventually, the water hands will slam down on the platform, dealing high damage and debuffing players with vulnerability up. This seems like a lot of stuff happening at once, but if you look at the hands closely, you'll notice that they're not all facing in the same direction. Since players will find themselves on one side of the platform, they just need to ensure they're not in the way of a hand that's facing towards their side. This will give them the room necessary to avoid the attacks and debuffs. The boss will also cast Rising Tide near the end of this sequence, a large cross-shaped AoE. Avoid as necessary. Periodically, you'll notice the grates around the room start bubbling with water. Eventually, these grates will spawn adds. To block too many adds from spawning, players can stand on these grates. When an add spawns, the boss will form a meat shield around her, rendering her invulnerable. Players will need to destroy any adds before resuming their attack on the boss. Make sure you're handling the other AoE attacks while you do this. The next Seabed Ceremony and Depth Grip will have hands spawning on either side of the platform. Each lane of hands will have a gap that players can use to avoid damage and debuffs. If you're facing bubbling grates and Depth Grip hands at the same time, players will only be able to safely block adds from grates that are not in front of hands. Luckily, the hands will also destroy the adds, so you won't have to deal with too many at a time. Flying Fonts will mark a player for stack up damage. Move in together to share the damage. Command Current will throw large AoE cones around the boss. There are 4 safe spots formed in between, and players will need to move into these to avoid excess damage. All of these mechanics will repeat until the boss is down. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll dive into the next Eden tier. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.